Hi, scientists! I have a riddle for you. Let's see if you can figure out what we're going to learn about this week. What has no arms or legs, moves slowly, and carries its house on its back? What kind of animal is that? If you guess snails, you're right. Snails come in a variety of shapes and sizes. Let's look at a few. Here are some pictures. These are black turban snails. Their shell is black and it kind of swoops around in a corner and comes to a point like a hat. This is a brown garden snail. It would be a land snail. This is a banded garden snail, another land snail. This is a Roman snail, also a land snail. This is a ram's horn snail. This is one of the water snails that we have that we're going to observe. This is a textile cone snail and a giant African land snail. And this one's fun. It's a flamingo tongue snail. Because snails move so slow, Mrs. Whitver set up a time-lapse camera to record the two different kinds of snails that we have to look at. The first snail we're going to look at is the common pond snail. Our common pond snail looks a lot like this one, except it's a little bit more black and it comes to a white tipped point. Now, when I started recording the time lapse, our snails actually still lived at school a long time ago, but Mrs. Whitver brought them back. So our time lapse video will start out at school and then it will transfer to Mrs. Whitver's house as we watch our snails move around the tank. Mrs. Whitver wants you to look at where our snails move. Do they stay in the water? Do they come out of the water? What do they eat? What do you notice about our snails? Do they stay apart? Do they come together? Let's take a look at our time lapse. Here are our snails at school. Mrs. Whitver had just given them clean water and I had tossed in a few carrot coins. The plant in the water is called Alodia. You'll see the video kind of go light and dark as the sun sets and the sun rises. This is the next day. Look, even some of the snails are above water on the edges of the tank. It looks like they move super fast, but remember, this is over an entire day. Now the snails are at Mrs. Whitver's house. You can see that they still move around the tank. Some of them go above the water, but most of the time, they're below the water. They move around. Sometimes they group together over one of the pieces of food. Since Mrs. Whitver has had them at her house, I've noticed that they tell me when it is time to change the water. I know it's time to change the water because in the morning, almost every single one of the snails will be above the water line, hanging out. That tells me that they don't like the water and I need to switch it. After watching this time lapse, I notice that the pond snails really love the carrots, but they don't like the Alodia as much. One of the fun things to observe about the pond snails is their mouth as they eat. You can notice on this pond snail that its mouth opens and it kind of scrapes the side of the container with its two teeth as it opens and scrapes and shuts, opens and scrapes and shuts. Now that we've watched our pond snails, let's go take a look at the ram's horn snails. Ram's horn snails come in a variety of different colors: pink, blue, purple, and then a brownish color. Ram's horn snails get their name from the shape. They look like a ram's horn, how they spin around and around. These are some pictures of the ram's horn snails in our tank. Let's watch our ram's horn snails for a minute. I notice that they like carrots just as much as our pond snails. But I also see them on the Elodia. They like to move up and down and eat the carrots and the plant. I also know that snails don't eat living vegetation. They eat the parts of the plant or the carrot that are dying. I do not notice our snails going above the water as much as our pond snails do. You can even see on the right-hand side the pond snails above the water in their tank. You'll notice now that I moved the label for our ram's horn snails and I've cleaned the water tank. I noticed that several of our ram's horn snails had been changing color and a few of them had even died. I was doing some reading and I learned that they needed calcium. So I had read that you could put in some eggshells for them to eat. I also learned that you could put in a little piece of Tums because Tums had calcium. So I added some Tums to our water as well. What this did is it ended up making our water cloudy fast. So you can see right now that the water isn't as clear. Also, if you look really close, it looks like there's all these tiny little dots moving all over the rocks at the bottom and this side of the tank. Our ram's horn snails actually laid egg sacs on the Elodia, and those egg sacs hatched baby snails, and the baby snails are all over the tank. Those baby snails are hard to see on this video, but they're even really hard to see up close in person. They're so small, and sometimes they look almost clear. But one thing I know is I can't change this cloudy water because I don't know how to keep all those baby snails in the tank when I switch the water out. What am I gonna do? From watching the ram's horn snails, I know that they like carrots just as much as the pond snails, but they also like to eat the Elodia. I also know that they prefer to stay underneath the water and not go above the water line like our pond snails. Did you have fun observing the pond snails and the ram's horn snails today? Mrs. Whitford sometimes finds herself just sitting there at the table watching the pond snails and the ram's horn snails. I've even caught my cat watching them through the tank window. I'm sure happy that there's a lid on the top, or else she might be fishing for some snails. Tomorrow, we're going to look at the snail parts, and then you're going to have time to draw either a pond snail or a ram's horn snail, and then write one thing that you know about that snail.